The auction room fell silent as a young widow, in plain gray wool, set a worn leather purse down on the table and asked for the deed to the one field that had ruined 3 families. Broke across the benches when the auctioneer asked if she understood what she was buying, and her answer was quieter than the room expected. 2 miles west, that ground waited under a bright, cold sky. 40 acres of ash-gray dirt that ran through her fingers like flour and would not hold the print of her hand. Crouched at the edge of it and scraped down 3 inches, where the gray gave way to a faint, stubborn line of brown. Back in her grandfather's house, a loose board in the pantry wall came away beneath her fingers, and behind it sat a rusted coffee tin no one had touched in nearly 30 years. Inside were 3 pounds of seed, small and hard and nearly black, saved by a woman she had never met against the day the land forgot how to feed itself. On a horse at the fence line, the richest man in the county watched her turn that dead earth by hand and smiled the way a man smiles when he has already read the ending. Far to the north, a thin orange stain was spreading across every identical field between her and the horizon, moving south on the wind toward the only thing still standing in its path. The auction house on the north edge of Coldwater smelled of dust and cold coffee and the particular staleness of a room where men gather to buy what other men have failed to keep. Verna Merrick walked through the door at 9 in the morning with a leather purse held against her ribs, and every head in the place turned to look at her, because a woman did not come to a delinquent tax auction alone, and a young one did not come at all. 26, and dressed in the plain gray wool she wore for mending days, her hair pinned back without ornament, her chin level in a way that made 2 men near the stove stop their talking. She kept walking to the front and did not look at any of them. An older man by the door tipped his hat back and studied her with something that was almost kindness. "You here for your husband, ma'am?" She had no husband to be there for, and there was no short way to say that. So she said nothing and took a place near the auctioneer's table where the ledger lay open and the small crowd could see her clearly. The auctioneer read through the early lots, in the bored cadence of a man performing a duty the county required of him, whether or not anyone answered. A quarter section gone for back taxes. A town lot with a burned foundation. A strip of bottomland nobody wanted because the creek took it every second spring. He read the legal descriptions, waited the required breath, struck each one down, and moved on. Verna waded through 11 of them, with her thumb resting on the clasp of the purse, feeling the weight of the coin inside shift when she breathed. Then he came to the 40 acres 2 miles west, and something changed in the room before he even finished the description. Men who had been half asleep sat forward. The auctioneer read the metes and bounds, the section and township and range, and when he reached the end, he did not bother with the usual invitation to bid. He looked out over the room and asked, with the flat certainty of a man reading the weather, whether there was any interest at all in the Vane place. And the way he said the name told the whole history, without a single number attached to it. Verna set the purse on the table and unwrapped the drawstring. "I'll take the deed." The laughter began in the back, near the stove, where a man in a canvas coat slapped his knee and said loud enough for the room that somebody ought to sell the widow a shovel while she was at it, because she'd need one to bury her money. Rolled forward over the benches. It bounced off the pressed tin ceiling and came back down doubled. The auctioneer himself pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose and let a breath out through his teeth, and when he had command of his face again, he leaned toward her across the ledger. "You understand what you're buying, Mrs. Merrick?" She met his eyes without any heat in her own. "Better than you do." She opened the purse and began to count the coin onto the table, and because it was all small money, half dollars and quarters and dimes, and a fistful of nickels earned a mending job at a time, the counting took a long while. She stacked it in even columns, sliding each one toward him as it reached $1, and the room quieted by degrees, not out of respect at first, but out of a slow dawning understanding that she meant it, that this was not a joke a woman had wandered in to make, that the sum climbing across the table was every cent she owned in the world, laid out in the open for men to watch. The man in the canvas coat stopped slapping his knee. Somebody near the window took off his hat. The auctioneer counted, along with her, under his breath, and when the columns matched the delinquent taxes owed against the Vane place, he stopped her with a raised hand because she had reached the figure, and there was no rule that said a person had to give more than the debt when no one else would give anything. He wrote her name in the ledger in a careful hand. He blotted it. He turned the deed toward her and set the pen beside it, and while she signed, he watched her the way a man watches a thing he does not have a category for. She folded the paper into quarters, put it inside her coat against her heart, and swept the last coins that were not owed back into the purse. There were not many. She walked out of that building with a deed to 40 acres of the worst ground in 3 counties and a little over $12 to her name. And behind her, the room stayed quiet for a good while after the door had shut. The land she had bought lay 2 miles west of town, on a road the county had not graded in 2 seasons, and everyone in Coldwater knew it, the way children know a story meant to frighten them into behaving. It was 40 acres of gray, not the black loam that made the rest of the county rich, not even the honest yellow clay a man could at least curse and work around, but a pale ashen dirt the color of a cold hearth, the color of something that had given everything it had and then been asked for more. For 60 years it had been cropped without rest, wheat on wheat on wheat, and when the wheat stopped paying, the men who held it had poured on every powder and tonic the almanacs promised would bring it back, and each thing they poured burned it a little further down. 3 families had gone broke on those 40 acres. 2 marriages had come apart over the mortgage that outlived the harvest. The last man to hold the deed, Orrin Vane, had walked off it in the middle of a night with the reins still looped over the plow handle and never put his hand to a furrow again, and the old men at the store still dropped their voices when they said his name. A professor from the college at Ames had come out once with a wooden case of glass tubes and pronounced the ground past reclaiming, and the county had carried it on the auction list every spring since, reading it out so it could say it had tried, expecting no answer and getting none, until now. Coldwater itself was a wheat town that had already seen its best years go by without quite noticing. It sat on Sable Creek, where the water ran shallow and brown, and it had a church whose roof let the rain in when the rain came hard, and a store run by Della Fisk that sold seed and thread and nails and gossip, and a grain elevator by the depot where a telegraph key ticked out the price of wheat from the exchange in the city and set the mood of the whole town by what it said. The families that founded the place had come with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the stubborn belief that a person ought to own the ground under his feet. And for a while there had been more of them, and a bank, and talk of the railroad putting in a proper station. The talk had come to nothing. The families had thinned. What remained was a town that remembered being larger and had learned to speak of the past in a certain tone, half pride and half apology, the way people speak of a thing they suspect they let slip through their fingers. Verna had lived at the edge of it since she was a girl, in the low house her grandfather built, and it was to that house she drove back from the auction with the deed against her chest and the empty feeling of a woman who has just done a thing that cannot be undone. Silas Merrick had raised her in that house through all the years her own path bent and broke, and he had died the previous autumn, quietly, in the chair by the window, the broken clock in his lap that he had promised a neighbor he would have running by Sunday. He had been a mender of things. His hands never came fully clean. There was always a dark seam of oil worked into the creases and under the nails, no matter how long he stood at the basin. He kept what other men threw away: hinges and springs and bent nails and screws, sorted by size into jars along a shelf in the barn, each jar labeled in pencil on a strip of paper glued to the glass. And the whole county brought him what was broken, because he could fix anything and charged almost nothing to do it. When Verna was young and told him he let people take advantage, he wiped his hands on the rag he kept in his back pocket and told her that a man in a small town gets paid in ways that do not fit inside a purse, and she had not understood him then, and understood him better now that he was gone. The Merricks had held 200 acres once. Verna had grown up knowing that number the way other children knew a verse of scripture, recited and familiar, and never once explained. By the time she was old enough to walk the fence line with her grandfather, it was a house and a garden plot and the memory of the rest, and nobody in the family said out loud how it had gone from the one to the other. When she asked him directly, standing in the barn door while he cleaned the works of a pocket watch, with a bird's feather he was a long time answering. He wiped each small part and set it in a row on the cloth before he spoke. Land doesn't betray you, he told her. People do. That was the whole of it. He went back to the watch, and she went back to the house, and the subject closed itself for years. She had not thought to open it again until the week her mother told her the house would have to be sold. Marta Merrick made that decision the way she made all her decisions. Somewhere out of sight, and then announced flat across the kitchen table, with no room left in it for discussion. She cooked at the boarding house near the depot, and came home smelling of grease and other people's suppers, her feet swollen in her boots. And she had counted what the house might bring, and what the years ahead would cost, and she had decided. The money would go to Verna. There was a married sister in Chicago with a spare room, and a husband who worked for the streetcar company, and a woman alone with no land and no husband, had no business, staying in a dying town waiting for her looks to leave her. Verna did not argue, because she could add as well as her mother could, and she knew what the boarding house paid and what it took out of a woman to earn it. She agreed to clear the house so it could be listed in the spring. Her brother Harmon, who kept books in the county seat and had spent his adult life putting distance between himself and the smell of a barn, agreed to handle the sale and was plainly relieved that the last thread tying the family to farming was about to be cut. So on a cold Saturday in March, Verna climbed into the loft of her grandfather's house with a lamp and a rag over her hair, meaning to empty the crawl space under the eaves where a family leavings had been pushed back into the dark and forgotten. She worked for the better part of 2 hours, hauling out moth-eaten quilts, and a cradle with a broken rocker, and a crate of canning jars furred with dust, and she had nearly reached the far wall when her knee came down on something that was not floor. She held the lamp low. Under a tarp gone stiff and cracked with age, under a fall of brittle bedding, was the corner of a wooden chest, and when she dragged it into the lamplight, the rusted lock came away in her fingers like a clod of dried mud. The smell reached her first, cedar and old paper and the faint sweetness of ink that has been drying a very long time. Inside were books, not two or three but dozens, leather-bound, their spines cracked and their pages swollen with damp long since dried, stacked in careful rows as though someone had meant them to be found in order. On top of the books, folded into quarters and on the brown of weak tea, was a map. She opened the map first because it lay on top, and because a map asked less of a person than a diary did. It took her a moment to make sense of it, to find the creek and the section lines, and the road that was now the county track. When she found the parcel she was looking for, she went still, and the cold of the loft came into her all at once because the 40 acres were marked on that old plat in a surveyor's careful hand as Merrick land were the same 40 acres the whole county now called the Vane Place. The same 40 acres whose deed lay folded against her heart at that moment. And in the margin beside them, written later, in a different hand, an official hand, was a date and a single word. 1873. Foreclosure. She sat back on her heels and did not move for a long while. Below the map, tucked into its folds as though hidden there on purpose, were three letters. She unfolded them one at a time. They were from the county bank, and they were all of them courteous, and they were all of them a refusal. Each one declined an application for a loan to replant, phrased in the soft language men use when they are taking something, and would prefer not to be thought unkind about it. Each one was signed by the same hand. She read the signature 3 times before the name settled into her, because it was a name she knew, a name that still meant money and land and a seat on every board worth sitting on in that part of the state. The third letter was dated 11 days before the foreclosure notice would have gone out. A man had written that he regretted he could not extend further credit at this time, and 11 days later the ground was no longer the family's. Verna understood, sitting there in the cold with the letters in her lap, why her grandfather had never in her memory driven the West Road past his own mailbox. The land had not been lost the way a careless man loses a thing, slowly legally, on letterhead, in a year when money was scarce across the whole country and a bank could squeeze a family until the ground fell out of their hands and into better financed ones. And it had all been done so politely that no law had been broken and no name had been stained but the family's own. Folded the three letters along their old creases and set them on the floor beside her, and she reached for the books. They belonged to her great-grandmother, Adeline Merrick, the name written in a firm, upright hand on the flyleaf of the first, a woman Verna knew only from a single stern tintype on the mantel downstairs, hard-faced, her hair scraped back, wearing a dress that looked as though it could stand on its own. In the photograph, she was a stranger, unsmiling, judging the room from beyond the grave. In the books, she talked. She talked, page after page, in a plain, unhurried voice, mostly about wheat. Not the wheat that grew in the fields around Coldwater now, the short, even wheat bred to stand in a straight rank and fall to a machine. Adeline's wheat was called Blackbird, and its hull was so dark it showed blue in a low light, and its roots, she wrote, went down past the depth where the milling wheats gave up and quit, down into water that no dry summer could reach. Verna read by the lamp in the loft until the oil burned low, and then she carried the books down to the kitchen and read the rest of that night and most of the next day, forgetting to eat, forgetting the cold, following the voice of a woman near 30 years dead through drought and want, and the slow turning of the seasons on ground the family no longer owned. Adeline wrote about the year the whole county baked hard as a brick floor, and Blackbird made a crop when nothing else in the township so much as headed out. She wrote about the way the grain came uneven, some stalks tall and some short, some heads heavy and some light, and how the men from the newer farms laughed at the raggedness of it until the raggedness was the only thing standing in a bad year. And she wrote, more than once, in words Verna went back and read twice, about the rust. A sickness that came down out of the north every few years on the wind, orange as pipe scale, and took every field that was all one thing, every field where the plants stood identical, shoulder to shoulder, like soldiers wearing the same coat, because a blight that learned to beat one of them had beaten all of them in the same stroke. Blackbird it could not take. Blackbird was a mongrel. Adeline wrote, 100 kinds of wheat crowded into one field under one name, no two plants quite alike, and a sickness that broke one of them still found the next one strange and the next, and could not run through the hole the way fire runs through dry grass. She wrote of where it had come from. Her own mother's people had carried the seed west out of the Virginia hills when they came to the frontier with nothing they had not been able to wear or hide, and the seed had come sewn into the hem of a skirt, 3 handfuls of it stitched into the cloth by a woman who was leaving a place with permission to take nothing at all. A woman turned off her ground with leave to carry nothing, Adeline wrote, can still carry the future out with her, if she is willing to stitch it into her clothes and walk. Verna read that line by lamplight with her hand pressed flat against the page, as though she could feel through the paper the shape of the hand that had written it. The last entries were the hardest to read, because the hand had begun to fail, and because the woman behind them knew it. The buyers had come, Adeline wrote, the men from the mills and the seed houses, and they said the old grains were finished, that a modern farm had no place for a wheat that would not stand even in a row, that progress meant leaving such things behind. She did not argue with them. She was too old to argue and too tired, and she suspected they might be right for a season or two. But she had put 3 pounds of blackbird seed into a tin and sealed it and hidden it away, against the day the land forgot how to feed itself, so that someone would remember for it when that day came. She wrote that she would likely not live to be proven right or wrong, and that this did not trouble her as much as it once might have, and that she had planted her whole life on the faith that a thing worth keeping is worth keeping, even by a fool who will never see the use of it. Then the entries stopped. Verna set the last book down on the kitchen table in the gray hour before dawn and sat with her hands around a cup of coffee gone cold. She was thinking about the pantry. Her grandfather's house had a pantry that had been rebuilt once, years ago, when the roof was reshingled, but the back wall was original, and there was a board low in the corner that had never sat flush against its neighbors. Silas had never bothered to fix it, which was strange in a man who could not walk past a broken hinge, and Verna had wondered about it sometimes as a girl, and then stopped wondering. She rose from the table while the light was still gray and went to the pantry with a candle and knelt in the corner and worked the loose board with her fingers. It came away easier than it should have, as though it had been meant to. Behind it was a hollow between the studs, and in the hollow, back against the outer boards where no daylight had ever touched it, was a coffee tin gone green at every seam, its lid sealed round with wax paper folded 3 times over the rim. He carried it to the table and worked the wax free and pried the lid. Inside were seeds, small heart, so dark they were nearly black, 3 pounds of them, by the weight, cool and dry and perfect. 4 generations of women sat in that rusted can, hidden behind a wall through a foreclosure and a burial, and the slow forgetting of a family, waiting for a hand to open them. Verna sat with the tin in her lap and did not move until the window went from gray to gold. She did not tell her mother that morning or the next. She waited until Thursday, until Marta had slept a full night and eaten a proper supper, and then she laid it all out on the kitchen table in the order she had found it, the map first, then the 3 letters, then the books, then the tin. She watched her mother's face as she read the 3rd letter, the one dated 11 days before the end, and she watched her read it a second time, and when Marta set it down, her face had gone very still and old. "I know," Marta said. Verna looked up. "Your grandfather knew the whole of it. Every letter, every date. He knew who signed them." Marta folded the letter closed along its worn creases and smoothed it flat with the side of her hand. He wasn't a man to spend his life chewing on a thing he couldn't swallow. He put it in a box, and he shut the lid, and he mended other people's clocks, and I thought that was weakness in him for the longest time. She was quiet a moment. It wasn't. Harmon came out on Friday, having heard something of it from their mother, and he stood in the kitchen in his town coat and looked at the map and the tin with the expression of a man watching a fire start in a room he cannot leave. "We lost land once," he said. "This family. We lost it once, and it about broke Granddad to carry it, and now you want to be the one who does it again. On purpose. With your own money." He pressed his knuckles to the table. "Tell me I'm hearing you wrong." But she had not asked his opinion, and she did not defend herself to him, and after a while he took his hat off the peg and left, and the borrowed wagon threw gravel in the yard. Her mother to go with her to the bank, and Marta went. They sat across a broad desk from a loan officer who was young and clean and perfectly courteous, who called Verna ma'am, and folded his hands and explained, real regret in his voice, that the property in question carried a classification that made it worthless as security against a loan, and that in any case a widow's circumstances did not support additional lending at the present time. The whole conversation took 19 minutes. Verna watched a fly work its way up the inside of the window glass while the young man talked, and she thought about a different man at a different desk in the same building, writing 3 courteous letters in the year 1873. In the wagon afterward, Marta sat with her hands folded in her lap and did not pick up the reins for a while. 13 years I've been in this county since your father passed," she said, looking straight ahead through the horse's ears at nothing. "Same building, same desk, near enough. Same answer." She clicked her tongue, and the horse leaned into the traces. "They don't even know they're doing it. That's the part that wears on you. To them, it's only arithmetic." The money Verna had was not much, and every dollar of it had a name already spoken over it. There were the coins earned mending, careful and slow, and there was the small purse her husband had left, which was all that remained of the man himself 2 years after the fever took him, and together it came to something under $200. Marta had said the word Chicago over it more than once, in the flat reverent tone other people saved for prayer, because that money was a train ticket and a fresh start and a room in a house where nobody knew that the Merricks had lost their land. Verna sat on the floor of her own room the night after the bank, with the money counted out on the boards in front of her and the coffee tin sitting beside it, and she understood with a cold and total clarity that these 2 things could not both go on existing. She could keep the money and let the seed sit in the can another lifetime, and some other woman's granddaughter could open it and face the same choice. Or she could put the seed in the ground and have nothing. And there was a third thing she understood, sitting there, which was harder than the other 2. No other ground would do. She had read enough of Adeline's books to know that Blackbird did not want good dirt. Good dirt grew the soft, even wheats that fell to rust the first bad year. Blackbird wanted to work, wanted to drive its roots down through hardship into the water below, and there was no ground in the county harder than the 40 acres 2 miles west. More than that, she needed land no one would bid against her, for land so worthless that not a man in Coldwater would raise a hand to take it from a widow, and there was exactly one parcel in the whole county that fit that description. It was the parcel a bank had taken from her own great-grandmother's family in a lean year, with 3 polite letters and a signature. Put the lid back on the tin and did not sleep much that night, and in the morning she drove to the auction, and by 10 o'clock she owned it. The drive out to see what she had bought took the better part of an hour on that ungraded road, and Marta came along. Because a woman ought not to face a thing like that alone, whatever she had decided about it. Came over the last rise, and the place opened out in front of them, and it was worse in the daylight than the stories had made it. The gate hung from a single hinge, rusted open, canted into the weeds like a broken arm. The house leaned as though it were trying to walk off its own foundation. The barn stood with its door long gone, dark inside as an open mouth, and the fields ran out from all of it in every direction, cracked into plates the size of a dinner platter, nothing growing in them but thistle and bindweed down in the low places where water had once stood. Verna stepped down from the wagon. The wind came across the open ground, dry and warm too early in the year, and it carried the gray dust up off the fields in thin ribbons that stung her eyes. She walked to the edge of the nearest field and crouched and took up a handful of the dirt, and it ran through her fingers like flour, like ash, like something that had forgotten how to be soil. When she closed her fist on it, it did not pack. Good ground holds its shape when you squeeze it, keeps the print of your hand. This fell open the moment she loosened her fingers, and the wind took the rest off her palm in a small gray cloud and carried it away over the field. Behind her, she heard her mother let out a slow breath. Marta had not come down from the wagon seat. She sat, with her arms crossed over herself, looking out at the ruin her daughter had bought, with a train ticket to a better life. You see it now, she said, and there was no cruelty in it, only a mother's grief laid bare. You see what they were laughing at. But Verna was no longer looking at the dust in her hand. She had scraped down with her fingers where she had lifted the loose top away, 3 inches, perhaps 4, and there was a line down there. Above the line, the dirt was gray, the color of everything on the surface, the color of quit. Below the line, faint and dull, but there, unmistakably there, was brown. She sat back on her heels and looked at it for a long time. The powders and the tonics and the years of hard cropping had burned the surface of that ground, had killed everything living in the top few inches and turned it to gray flour. But the earth underneath had not gone anywhere. It was tired, and it was hurt, and it had been waiting a long time in the dark, under its own dead skin, and the only thing standing between it and the daylight was a crust of poisoned dust a few inches thick. Anything with roots strong enough to punch down through that crust would find real earth waiting on the other side. Thought of a dark seed that drove its roots past the depth where softer wheats gave up. She thought of a woman, near 30 years dead, who had known this ground when it was black and rich and had saved the one thing that might reach back down to what was left of it. She stood and wiped her hand on her skirt. I need a plow, she said, more to the field than to her mother. What she had was 3 pounds of seed, and 3 pounds of seed sown by hand covered about 2 acres, and the other 38 would have to wait until the two had earned them. That arithmetic did not comfort Marta in the slightest, but it did make the thing in front of Verna a thing a person could actually do. She bought a second-hand breaking plow and a harrow off a man in the next township who was glad to be rid of them and asked $9 for the pair. And she paid him with money she did not have by promising to mend the pump he had been carrying water past all winter, and she mended it that same afternoon with parts she carried in her apron pocket from her grandfather's jars. The plow smoked at the coulter, and the harrow had a tooth sprung loose, but she had learned iron and wood and the coaxing of tired machinery at the elbow of a man who never in his life threw away a thing that could be made to work once more. and she kept both of them running on what she found in the labeled jars along the barn shelf. She began in the first week of May, and she worked the way her grandfather had worked, from before the light came up until the heat drove her into the shade of the leaning barn near midday, and then again from the cool of late afternoon until she could no longer see the furrow in front of her. She broke the crust with the plow where the plow would bite, and with a shovel where it would not, and with her hands and a mattock where the ground had baked too hard for either. She hauled compost the 2 miles from the town's leavings, and stable muck she earned by mucking the stalls that made it, and wood ash from every hearth in Coldwater, whose owner would let her carry it away, and she worked all of it down into the broken ground, and slowly, over the length of that month, the top few inches of 2 acres went from the gray of a cold hearth to a mottled brown black that held together when she pressed it. The town found out inside a week, and once it knew, it did not leave her alone about it. The first to come was the man who had signed the letters. Gideon Thorne was past 70 now, but he sat a horse as straight as a fence post, and he rode out to the 40 acres on a fine bay mare one morning without troubling to ask leave, because in 50 years of holding more land than the rest of the township put together, he had never once been told there was a line he could not cross. He drew up at the edge of the 2 acres she had turned and looked at the small dark rectangle of worked earth set into all that gray emptiness like a postage stamp stuck to the side of a barn. And then he looked at the woman standing in the middle of it with a shovel taller than she was, and he laughed. It was not the loud laughter of the auction room. It was low and comfortable and entirely without malice, the laugh of a man who has already read the last page and is amused to find someone still working through the first. You know what that dirt is, Mrs. Merrick? She did not stop working. It's soil. It's alkali crust over sour subsoil. It's ground with the life burned clean out of it. You could pour a rain barrel over it and watch it run off like it hit a plank sidewalk. He leaned forward with both hands folded on the horn of his saddle, at his ease. Your grandfather farmed 40 years 2 miles east of here, and a better hand with tired ground never lived in this county, and he never once put a wheel on this place. You know why? She straightened and rested her weight on the shovel and looked up at him, and there was a steadiness in her face that unsettled him more than any argument could have. Because it was not the steadiness of anger. Because he knew what it was, she said. Because he was smart enough not to. Thorne's voice cooled by a degree. A widow who read something in a dead woman's notebook knows this ground better than the men who've broken their backs on it since before your mother was born. No, she said. I don't think I know better than you, Mr. Thorne. I think this land is different from what everyone decided it was, and I think this whole county stopped listening to it about 30 years ago. She held his eyes. About the time the old grains went out of fashion. Whatever was in the way, she said it reached him, because his jaw worked once, and he sat up out of his ease, and he turned the mare in a tight circle that threw a fan of gray dust across the hem of her skirt and the tops of her boots, and he rode back the way he had come without another word. But he had brought a hand along with him, a young man of perhaps 20, who had held back at the fence line the whole while. And when Thorne rode off, the young man did not immediately follow. He looked at her for a moment longer, 3 full seconds, and he was not laughing. And then he touched his hat and turned his horse and was gone over the rise after his employer. The store was the next place it found her. Della Fisk had known Verna since she was small enough to be handed a peppermint stick across that same counter to keep her quiet while her mother traded, and Della rang up the bag of bone meal. Verna sat down with a look of open grief on her broad, kind face, and she could not let it go without speaking. Honey, I can't take your money for this in good conscience without saying my piece. She set both hands flat on the counter. You are throwing it away. Your mother's flour money, hauled 2 miles out and buried in ground the Lord himself gave up on. I've watched 3 families break on that place, and I nursed one of the wives through what it did to her, and I cannot stand here and sell you the shovel to dig your own well of grief. Verna counted the coins out onto the worn wood. I take that kindly, Della. I do. But you'll do it anyway. I'll do it anyway. Della swept the coins into her palm and shook her head slowly. Well, Honesty's about all I've got to sell that's worth anything. That and a store full of things that won't fix dead dirt. Put the bone meal in Verna's arms and held on to it a second longer than she needed to. You come tell me the day you want to stop. There's no shame in it. Stopping while stopping still leaves you something is the wisest thing some folks ever do. The hardest of them came up her own drive on a Sunday, and it was Harmon. He had put on a clean collar for it, as though he were calling on a stranger, and he stood at the edge of the two-turned acres and would not step down into the dirt. And he spoke to her in the careful, reasonable voice he used with debtors at the county office. I'm going to talk to you like a grown woman, since that's plainly what you want to be treated as. He clasped his hands behind his back. I've spoken to Mother. We'll list Granddad's house in the fall like we planned. And after the fees are paid, you'll have enough to go to Chicago and start clean. And in 10 years, you'll sit at our sister's table and laugh about the spring you nearly threw your whole life into a hole in the ground. He tipped his head toward the field. Because that's what this is, Verna. That's all it is. A hole in the ground that money falls into and never comes back out. Her hands had blistered through her gloves that week, and the small of her back had ached since Thursday, and she was very tired. But she looked at her brother, and her voice did not rise. It's not the same as before. It is exactly the same. It's this family losing ground. It can't afford to lose. One more time. Because it can't let the past alone. The past, she said, is the only thing that ever fed this family when the present failed it. You'd know that if you'd read what I found. But he had not come to read anything, and he had not come to be answered. And after a while, he tipped his hat the way a man does when he has discharged a duty, and he got into his borrowed wagon and drove off, and she picked up the shovel and went back to work. Because the work did not care who had come or what they had said, and there was a great deal of it left to do. The one thing that surprised her came the following Saturday. The young man who had held back at the fence rode up alone, on a horse that was plainly his own, and not Thorne's, and he swung down without a word and set to resetting the fence posts along the north line that had rotted through and fallen, tamping each one straight, with a bar and a bucket of creek gravel, as though he had been hired to it. He worked most of the morning before she came over to him, and she stood a moment watching him seat a post before she asked what she wanted to ask. Why? Reuben Ashby wiped his forehead with the back of his wrist and looked off toward the far fence line rather than at her. My grandmother kept a garden through the hard years, down a farm my people had in Ohio before we came west. Ground everybody told her was no good, wouldn't grow a weed. He set the bar down and rested his boot on it. She fed 6 of us off it, clear through 2 winters that starved better farms than ours. He shrugged, still looking away. I guess I've got a soft spot for gardens that aren't supposed to work. Verna crouched and steadied the post while he tamped the gravel down around it. It's not that it's not supposed to work, she said. It works fine. It just takes longer than most folks are willing to wait, and there's not many left who'll stand the waiting. He looked at her then and nodded once, and they set the rest of the post together, without much more said between them. By the end of May, she had turned her 2 acres and worked them until the top hand's depth was no longer gray but a dark and honest brown, and she had sown a strip of crimson clover down between the marked rows, not because the wheat would need the nitrogen yet, but because she needed with an ache she could not fully explain to see something green come up out of that ground before she trusted it with the last of Adeline's seed. The clover came. It was thin, and it was pale, and it stood no higher than her ankle. But it was green, and she stood at the fence line one evening with the light going gold and low across it and let herself off for the first time since the auction, believe. She waited for the full moon to plant because Adeline's books said to wait for it, and because she had stopped some weeks ago questioning anything the books told her. The first night of June came clear and cooler than the days had been, and there was light enough on the open ground to see the shallow furrows she had drawn with a hoe that afternoon. She had no seed drill. She had no machine of any kind to do it for her. She walked the rows with the coffee tin, cradled in the crook of her left arm, and her right hand dipping into it, and coming out and letting the dark seed fall in a thin, steady stream from her open palm, the way a woman scatters feed for hens, up one row and down the next, checking her pace against the length of the furrow to keep the sowing even. It took hours. The moon rose and crossed and started down. Her right hand cramped into a claw. From the same small motion made 10,000 times, and she shook it loose and went on, because there was no one to spell her, and no other way it could be done. Marta sat on the porch of the leaning house the whole while with a lantern in her lap, its wick turned low. She did not come down into the field, and she did not offer to help, because she had said everything she had to say about this back in the spring, and she was not a woman who said a thing twice. But she did not go inside either. She sat through the whole cold length of that night with the lantern glowing between her hands, and every so often, when Verna lost the line in the dark, the beam would swing out across the rows and find her and hold a moment and steady her and then drop away again. When the tin was finally empty and Verna came walking back up the field on legs that shook under her mother stood and handed her the water jug and looked at her for a long moment in the gray coming light. "It's in the ground," Verna said. Her mother did not smile, but she did not weep either, and she put her hand briefly against her daughter's cheek, and her palm was warm and smelled of lamp oil, and that was as near to a blessing as the night had in it to give. Then nothing happened, and the not happening was its own long trial. The first week there was nothing, and that was expected, because wheat takes its time even in good ground, and no one had ever called this good ground. Verna walked the rows at first light, and again at dusk, and saw nothing but brown dirt and the pale clover between the rows. The second week there was nothing, and she began to dig up single seeds to check them. One from the far end of a row where a gap would not matter, and she found them swollen and split and reaching. She made herself stop, because she had counted what a seed cost her, now that the tin stood empty on the shelf, and every one she pulled to look at was a plant that would never stand. In the third week, the heat came up hard out of the south and sat down over the whole county and would not move, and the telegraph key at the elevator ticked out falling prices all week long, and the ponds that had held through 2 dry summers went to cracked mud. Walking her north fence one evening in that heat, Verna saw the thing she had half been waiting for and half dreading. Thorne's fields, the wide green fields of his best seed, the wheat every man in the county measured his own against, had begun to curl at the leaf edge and go yellow at the base of the stalk, because they were all one thing. Every plant the twin of the plant beside it, and what struck one of them was striking all of them at once. Her own 2 acres sat gray and silent and gave her nothing even to worry over, because there was nothing standing in them yet to look stressed. Thorne rode the section road that week and slowed as he came level with her gate, and she was standing at it, and she saw his face clearly. What was on it was not the comfortable amusement of the spring. It was pity, plain and unhurried and settled. The pity of a man who has put his pencil down and stopped keeping the score because the game is already decided. Then he put his eyes back on the road and rode on. And that was worse than all the laughing had been, because laughing meant a man still thought there was something to laugh at, and pity meant he had already buried the thing in his mind and moved on. Della sent word by a neighbor's boy that a fellow over in the next town bought scrap iron by the pound, and that a plow like Verna's might bring $3 or $4, and there was no shame. The message said, "In stopping, while stopping still got you something." Verna thanked the boy and gave him a dipper of water and sent him home, and she sat on the floor of her kitchen that night, with her back against the cool of the cupboard, and stayed there a long while in the dark. Her mother stopped asking how it was going. She only left a jug of water on the fence post twice a day, on her way to the boarding house and on her way home, without a word said over it, and the silence she left behind her was not the silence of a woman who had given up on her daughter. It was the silence of a woman bracing herself to be standing there when the thing finally broke, so that her daughter would not have to break alone. On the 23rd morning, Verna walked out to the field before the sun was up, the way she had walked out every morning for 3 weeks, expecting the same gray rows and the same nothing. She was almost to the gate before her eyes told her mind what they were seeing, and then she stopped where she stood. There was a line of green running the whole length of the first row, not the pale uncertain green of clover deciding whether to commit to the world, not the sickly yellow-green of Thorne's stressed and dying wheat. This was dark, dark enough that in the flat gray light before dawn, it read almost blue against the brown of the earth. the deep blue-black green of a pine bough far back in the timber where the sun rarely reaches. She ran. She went down on her knees at the head of the first row and brushed the soil back from the base of the nearest shoot with her fingers. And there it was, a stem already thicker than any wheat she had ever put her hand to. Its first leaf unfurled broad and stiff, and standing straight up out of ground, a man from the college had sworn was past all reclaiming. She went to the second row on her knees, and it was green. The third was green. She got up and walked the whole planting. Every row she had sown by hand in the cold on the first night of June, and every single one of them had come. Not most. Not a fair stand with gaps a farmer learns to expect and forgive. Every seed that had left her open palm that night had woken in the worst dirt in 3 counties in the hottest June anyone living could recall, and thrust a dark green blade up into the light. She sat down in the middle of her own field, there in the dirt between the rows, with the sun just breaking over the timber to the east and laying long gold light down every furrow, and she put her hands over her face and stayed like that a good while, and there was no one within 2 miles to see her. And the wind came soft across the young wheat and moved it, and the dark green rows leaned all together and came back, the way a thing does when it is finally, after long waiting, alive. By the middle of July, the field had become a thing no one in Coldwater had ever laid eyes on, and word of it traveled differently than the word about the widow had traveled in the spring. Blackbird did not grow the way modern wheat grew, in a smooth, even carpet, with every head standing at the same trained height like a mowed lawn waiting for the machine. It grew rough and it grew wild. Some stalks no higher than Verna's waist and others already reaching past her shoulder, the heads heavy and dark and bearded, the leaves broad enough to draw a thin red line across the back of a hand that brushed them carelessly. She walked the rows, now not to check whether anything lived, but to marvel that all of it did. And one morning she took hold of a single plant near the edge, where it would not thin the stand, and drew it up whole to see what its roots had been doing in the dark while she slept. The root mass came up trailing dirt that was not gray. It was brown, dark and crumbling, and threaded through with fine pale hairs, and it smelled of the woods after a rain instead of smelling of nothing at all. And caught in the tangle of it, wriggling and confused in the sudden light, were 3 earthworms. There had not been an earthworm turned up on those 40 acres in 20 years. She knelt and set the plant carefully back into the hole it had come from and firmed the soil around it with both hands, because she could not bring herself to waste even one. And she understood as she pressed it back down that the roots were doing more than reaching water. They were pulling the dead ground back to life around themselves, a few inches at a time, only where they touched, only as far as they ran. But it was happening, and the worms were the proof of it, and the smell was the proof of it. And it was not something a man from a college could argue away with a case of glass tubes. The men still drove the section road past her gate, but they drove it slower now, and they had stopped saying the things they had said at the store and the diner in the spring, because a thing had grown up out of the ground that made the old jokes sit wrong in a man's mouth. Thorne went by twice a week and never once turned his head to look, which everyone in the county understood to be its own kind of statement. The statement of a man who has decided that a thing does not exist because he cannot afford for it to. Reuben came every rest day without being asked, and by the third week of July, he had rehung the barn door on hinges he forged himself over a fire in Silas's old smithy, so that the barn no longer stood open like a mouth, but could be shut against the weather. And he had begun patching the worst of the roof with cedar shakes he split by hand. He worked in a silence that was companionable rather than empty, and Verna paid him in the only coin she had, which was suppers at the kitchen table and the use of everything her grandfather had left in the way of tools, and neither of them spoke of the fact that he was still drawing wages from the man who had ridden out to laugh at her. Then, in the first week of August, the wind had shifted, and it came down out of the north, and it brought the sickness with it. It began, as it always begins, as almost nothing, 30 miles up the county line, in the wide holdings of 2 brothers named Miller, who farmed more acres of a single seed than any operation in that half of the state. A hired man walking a fence found a smear of orange on the upper surface of one flag leaf, no bigger than a thumbnail, and thought little of it because one leaf is one leaf. But it was not one leaf. It was the first of 10 million exactly like it. The rust that comes down on the wind does not spread the way a fire spreads, in a line a man can see and run ahead of. It spreads in a haze of spores too small for the eye, billions of them lifting off one field and settling on the next, and a field can be clean and green at sundown and going orange by the middle of the following week, and the only warning a man ever gets is the news that it has already reached his neighbor. Within 4 days, it was in Thorne's wheat. He was not a man to stand and watch a thing take what was his, and he did everything that money and 50 years of knowing could do. He hauled sulfur and dusted his fields with it, working his hands from first light in a yellow fog that turned his eyes red and his throat raw. When the dusting did not hold, he sent riders to bring more, and dusted again at half the interval, and still the orange crept up the stalks and browned the heads and turned standing grain to straw before it had filled. And when the whole north half of his best section had gone past saving, Gideon Thorne did the thing that no one who saw it ever forgot. He had it plowed under and he set fire to it, 400 acres of his finest wheat burning on a windless morning, with the smoke standing straight up in a black column that could be seen from the church steeple in town. And he sat his bay mare at the edge of it and watched it burn, because sometimes the only way to keep a wound from killing the whole body is to burn it clean, and a man who has farmed long enough knows it, however it tears at him to strike the match. The rust did not care what he burned. It had already learned everything his wheat had to teach it, and it moved on south, and it moved fast. By the second week of August, two of the three grain elevators between Coldwater and the county seat had shut their doors and thrown the bolts because there was no purpose in running the scales for grain no miller would buy. The telegraph key that had ticked out falling prices all through July now ticked out figures so low that a man standing on the elevator platform could watch a whole year's labor lose its worth while the field that had grown it still stood uncut behind him. 2 million acres before it was finished across that part of the plains. Men Verna had known the whole of her life stood at the edges of their ground in the evenings and watched it go the color of a rusted hinge, and there was nothing any of them could do but watch, because you cannot fight the wind, and the wind was carrying the ruin of them all. Her own field stood dark and untouched in the middle of it, and that was the thing that turned the town. It started as a mutter, and it hardened fast into something with a shape. Somebody said it first at the shut door of the near elevator, and it traveled from there. The strange black field on the old Vane place, the field the widow Merrick had grown out of a dead woman's superstition, that was where the sickness had come from. Not passed through. Started. It was not true. And the truth had nothing to do with how fast it went from mouth to mouth. Because a frightened man watching his living turn to straw needs a reason he can point at, and a reason that lives 2 miles down an ungraded road and belongs to a woman with no husband and no standing is the easiest reason in the world to reach for. Verna heard it come back to her through Della, who heard it at the counter and would not repeat, who had said it, only that it was being said and being believed. The letter came on a Friday afternoon, hand-delivered rather than left at the post office, and the man who brought it was Curtis Ray, who kept the county's agricultural records and had clerked 2 desks down from Harmon for 6 years and plainly wished the errand had fallen to any other man alive. Stood on the porch of the leaning house with his hat in his hands and would not quite meet her eye while she read it. It was a recommendation, the paper said, from the Agricultural College at Ames and the County Board of Agriculture jointly, that the standing crop on her parcel be destroyed by burning at the earliest opportunity to prevent the further spread of stem rust to neighboring holdings. She read it twice, standing in the door. It says, recommendation. It does. Curtis turns hat a slow half circle by the brim. The board hasn't got the authority to come onto your ground and burn a standing crop without an order from the state, and an order like that takes the better part of a week to draw and serve. He finally lifted his eyes to hers, and there was misery in them, so no, it isn't a rule. It's every farming man of learning in this half of the state telling you what they think you ought to do. which in some ways is worse than a rule, because if you go against it and this thing jumps your fence into somebody else's wheat, there won't be one scrap of paper anywhere that says a soul made you do a thing you didn't choose. He left the letter on the porch rail and touched his hat and drove off before she could decide whether to thank him. And she stood there holding the paper while the dust of his wagon settled back down over the road. Marta came out that evening and found her at the north fence, looking across it toward the Miller ground far off to the north, where the whole horizon had gone the dull orange of old iron. Her mother did not raise her voice. That was the thing that frightened Verna most, because Marta was a woman who grew loud when she was tired and went quiet when she was truly afraid, and her voice now was very quiet indeed. A boy rode out to the boarding house looking for you. From the board. She came and stood at the fence beside her daughter. They want it burned this week, before the spores get here. Before it's on us. They're already here. Verna kept her eyes on the far orange line. The wind's been out of the north 3 days. If it was coming, it's come. Whatever's going to land in that field has landed already. That is exactly what I'm afraid of. Marta took hold of her daughter's arm, not gently. Listen to me. That is a dead woman's handwriting in a notebook. It is not a survey. It is not a soil report signed by a man who studied the thing. It is Adeline's opinion, set down near 30 years ago. And if she was wrong, if she was one time wrong, that sickness comes into this field and it does not stop at your fence. It goes on out of here into every farm around us that hasn't already gone. Her fingers tightened. And do you know what happens then? You know as well as I do. They will say the Merrick woman had a warning in her hand and she tore it up and threw it in the dirt. They will say she was told and she did it anyway. And every man who lost his crop this year will believe it before you finish denying it. Because it is the easiest thing in the whole world for a beaten man to believe. Verna did not answer, because there was nothing in what her mother said that was not true, and both of them knew it. And Marta let go of her arm at last and stood beside her in the failing light and did not say anything more, because she had made her point and she was not a woman who made a point twice. The rest of that week made the point for her, over and over, in ways her mother never could have. On Thursday, two riders came out at dusk and sat their horses on the section line where the road ran nearest the house, out past the gate, and did nothing at all. They did not come through the fence. They did not call out. They sat their horses in the failing light where anyone in the house could see them plainly, and after 20 minutes or so, they turned and rode off into the dark. On Friday, they came back and did the same. Verna understood what it was. It was not a threat a man could name in front of a judge. It was the shape of a threat, the outline of one left where she would be sure to see it, so that she would lie awake filling in what was left blank. She did not sleep well those nights, but she did not burn the field either, and in the morning the dark green wheat still stood in its rows, heavy-headed and strange, waiting. She built her decision the way her grandfather had built everything, by laying the pieces out where she could see them, and turning each one over in her hands. If she burned it, she killed the last 3 pounds of a seed that 4 generations of women had carried out of the hills and through drought and dust and past a bank that took their land, and she proved every laughing man in the county right in a single afternoon, and she handed the ashes of it to Gideon Thorne. If she did not burn it, and she was wrong, she became, for the rest of her life, the woman who brought the ruin down on Coldwater, and there would be no living in the county after that, for her or her mother or the memory of anyone named Merrick. She had a notebook full of a dead woman's certainty and a field full of dark wheat, and she did not have one single soul in the whole state standing on her side of the fence, unless she counted a hired man who owed her nothing and came anyway, and she was not sure she had the right to count him, because standing with her might cost him the only wages he had. She was standing in the barn door, turning it over one more time when Reuben came out on Saturday, earlier than his usual, before the light had fully come, which was not like him. He did not say why he had come early. They walked the whole northern boundary together instead, 400 yards of fence line, going down the row nearest the fence one flag leaf at a time, turning each broad blade over to look at its underside, because the underside is where the rust shows first. They found nothing. They walked it again at midday in the full heat and found nothing, and again at 4 in the afternoon, and again as the light went, and by then neither of them had eaten since morning, and neither had spoken of it. At the last, standing by his horse in the near dark, Reuben finally said the thing he had ridden out early to say. He burned 400 acres. He looped the reins once around his fist and did not mount. Stood there in the smoke and watched every bit of it go. Best ground he owns. And then he rode home and ate his supper like it was any other Tuesday. He shook his head slowly. I've worked for the man 6 years. I've seen him bury a partner, and I've seen him foreclose on men he'd known his whole life. And never once did his hands shake. They shook that day. Standing in front of that fire, he swung up into the saddle. That's what's got hold of him now. Not the money he lost. He's got money enough to lose. It's that for the first time in 50 years, the ground did a thing he couldn't buy his way out of, and he doesn't know what to do with a world where that's so. He turned the horse. You be careful. There's men scared enough right now to do a foolish thing and call it protecting their families. The riders came a third time on Saturday at dusk, and this time Verna did not stay in the house. She walked out to the barn door while there was still light enough for them to see her, and she stood in the open mouth of it with the newly hung door at her back, and she put her hands at her sides, and she looked straight across the 200 yards of dying light at the two men on their horses, and she did not move. She simply stood where they could see that she saw them, and let them look, and let herself be looked at. In a town of 300 souls, most cruelty is a performance staged for the benefit of the man beside you, a thing done to be seen doing it, and it cannot survive being watched back with a level eye. She stood in the barn door until one of the horses shifted and its rider turned it, and the other followed, and the two of them rode off up the section road into the dark, and they did not come back a fourth time. No one ever came through her gate. Whatever the town had in it that week, it did not have in it a man willing to be the one who rode onto a widow's ground in the dark and put a torch to her field with his own hand while she stood in her own barn door and watched him do it. Sunday came, and the deadline the board had set passed at some hour no one had ever precisely named, which meant it passed the way most deadlines truly pass, with nothing at all to mark the moment of it. Verna did not burn the field. She rose before dawn and walked out to the north fence and turned her back on the road and the town and looked instead at what stood behind her. 100 miles of ruin to the north, near enough, the whole country up that way, gone, the color of rust on a nail. Her own 2 acres so dark a green that in the gray light before sunrise they still read as blue, the heads bowed heavy with grain, the stand rough and uneven and wrong beside every trained field in the county. The wind had held out of the north the whole while. What was going to happen had already happened, silently, in the dark, in their billions, and the only question left in the world was what the sickness had found when it landed. She began to walk the rows at 6 in the morning, not the boundary this time, but the rows themselves, one at a time, all the way down and all the way back, turning leaves. She found the first one in the 9th row, about 40 feet in. It was there, plain as a thumbprint pressed into wax, a raised orange pustule on the upper face of a flag leaf, the exact thing she had been staring at in the plates of the college pamphlet Curtis had left with the letter. It had broken clean through the surface of the leaf. It had landed, and it had taken, and it had established itself, the way it had established itself in 10 million leaves to the north of her. Verna went down onto her knees in the dirt and brought her face to within a hand's breadth of it and looked at it a long time. The leaf beneath the pustule was dark green and firm to the touch. Tissue around the orange spot had not gone yellow, had not curled, had not withered back the way the pamphlet plates showed it withering, had not done a single one of the things that leaf was supposed to do once the rust had it. She touched the pustule itself with the pad of her thumb, lightly, and it did not smear the way a living rust smears, did not leave that fine rust-colored dust across her skin. It was dry. It was dead. The sickness had come down on that leaf, and it had woken, and it had pushed its way up through the surface, and then something in the plant itself had reached up and stopped it exactly where it stood, killed it in the very act of breaking through, and gone on living around the small dead wound as though it were nothing at all. She found 40 more of them before noon, and every single one was the same. Arrived, established, finished, scattered through the field, one leaf here and one leaf there, with rows of clean green wheat between them, never spreading from the leaf it landed on to the leaf beside it, because the leaf beside it was a different plant, a cousin and not a copy, a lock the sickness had never seen and could not pick fast enough before the plant snuffed it out. On the far side of the fence, out on the ground she did not own, the volunteer wheat that had come up wild in the ditch and the wild grasses along the road were going orange in a solid band you could see the length of from the gate. The rust had come to the north fence of the old Vane place, and it had crossed it, and it had landed in her field the same as it had landed everywhere. And then it had simply failed, plant by plant, to find anything it could take, and it had died there in scattered orange flecks across 2 acres of the strangest, ruggedest, ugliest, most alive wheat in the whole of the ruined belt. Verna sat back in the dirt between the rows with the dead pustule still on her thumb, and she did not weep, though she had thought she might. All those nights she had lain awake waiting to learn which kind of woman she was going to have to be. She only sat there while the sun climbed and looked out over the dark heads, bending together in the wind, and she thought of a woman she had never met, gone the better part of a lifetime before she was born, who had sat somewhere writing by a failing hand that she would likely never learn whether she was a fool or not, and who had sealed 3 pounds of the future into a tin behind a wall anyway, on nothing but the faith that a thing worth keeping does not stop being worth keeping merely because the men in charge have declared it obsolete. She had been right. Near 30 years in the dark, and she had been right. And there was no one left alive who had known her to tell it to. So Verna told it to the field quietly, and the field bent all together in the wind and came back the way it did. Curtis Ray was the one who made the thing official because he had driven the section road on Tuesday on his way to write up another man's ruin, and he had seen the dark field standing whole in the middle of the orange, and he had pulled his wagon over on the shoulder and climbed down and stood at her fence for the better part of 10 minutes with his hat in his hand before he drove on. What he had seen sent him back to the county seat that same afternoon to the telegraph office, and the message he sent up to Ames was answered before the week was out. The party from the college came on Thursday morning. A botanist named Adelaide Frost drove down from Ames herself with 2 students in the wagon behind her, and a crate of instruments and glass and field presses lashed down under a canvas. She was a spare, plain-dressed woman, perhaps 40 years old, with ink permanently darkening the side of her right hand, and an unhurried way of looking at a thing that reminded Verna, strangely, of her grandfather bent over a stopped watch. She walked the 2 acres for 3 hours in the heat without once complaining of it, her students trailing her with the presses and a ledger, and she took leaf samples and root samples, and she had the students dig soil cores at 4 different depths and label each one, and she stood a long while at the fence line making careful drawings of the exact place where the orange ditch grass stopped and the green wheat began, and one of the students kept stepping back and forth across the property line, out into the orange and back into the green, over and over, the way a man tests a plank of a bridge he cannot believe will hold his weight. By then, the road along the front of the field was lined with wagons, nose to tail on both shoulders, because word of what the college had come to see had reached the town by mid-morning, and half of Coldwater had driven out to stand up along the fence and look. Della Fisk had come and stood up on the step of her buggy to see over the ditch. Men who had muttered at the elevator door 2 weeks before now stood along the wire with their hats pushed back, saying very little. And at the far end of the line of wagons, apart from the rest, sat a fine bay mare with Gideon Thorne on its back, and he did not get down, and he did not come to the fence. But he had come, and everyone saw that he had come. Adelaide Frost brought a covered dish out of the back of her wagon in the early afternoon, having studied the first of her samples under a glass on a folding table set up beneath the canvas, and she carried it the way a person carries a thing they have borrowed and are afraid of dropping, and she came and stood in front of Verna and turned the dish in the light so that Verna could see the pale threads clinging to the leaf inside it. It isn't resistance. Adelaide's voice was quiet, meant for Verna and not for the crowd along the fence. I want to be precise with you because precision is the only thing I have to offer that's worth anything. Resistance is when the plant catches the sickness and survives it. This is a different thing entirely. She tilted the dish. The spores land on your wheat and they wake, exactly as they do on any wheat in this state, and then they die at the point where they try to enter the leaf. The plant is making something that kills the rust in the very act of infection. I have read of such a thing in a handful of wild prairie grasses. I have never seen it in wheat. Not in any wheat, anywhere, in anything I have read or been taught or witnessed with my own eyes. Verna looked at the pale dead threads in the dish. My great-grandmother wrote that it stood through the rust. She didn't write why. She wouldn't have had the words for why. Almost no one does yet. Adelaide handed the dish back to a waiting student and turned to look out over the field with Verna, and when she spoke again, there was something in her voice that had not been there before, a carefulness, as though she were standing at the edge of something larger than she had driven down expecting. But she saw that it did, and she believed what she saw over what she was told, and that is rarer than the wheat. She was quiet a moment, watching the heads move. There's a second thing, and it's the greater of the two. Look at it. Truly look. That is not a stand of wheat in the way I would use the words. I can count a dozen different kinds out there from where I stand, by height, by the color of the beard, by the day the heads came out. Different plants, all of them kin, none of them copies of one another. She turned to Verna. The rust beats the wheat we grow because the wheat we grow is one plant 10 million times over. It learns the one lock, and every door in the state swings open. Out here, it would have to pick a dozen locks at once. In a single season, on ground that is trying to kill it besides, and it cannot, and it never had the smallest chance of doing it. Didn't lose to your field by bad luck. It lost because it was asked to do an impossible thing. She looked back at the strange dark white, bending and rising in the wind. Everyone told your great-grandmother the ragged old grains were finished. The raggedness was the whole strength of them. They threw away the one thing that would have saved them, and they called throwing it away progress. Nobody standing near enough to hear said anything to that. The wind moved through the field, and the heads went over all together and came back, and out along the fence 100 people who had come to see a foolish woman's ruin stood looking instead at the only living wheat in 100 miles, and slowly, one at a time, the men along the wire began to take off their hats, not for the woman, not yet, but for the field, for the plain, unarguable green fact of it, standing there where every acre they owned had turned to straw. Verna stood in the middle of her 2 acres with a dead woman's certainty proven true in a covered dish and a crowd of her neighbors gone silent at her fence. And she thought that the strangest part of being proven right was how little it felt like winning and how much it felt like being handed something heavy she would now have to carry the rest of her life. The last thing Adelaide Frost did before she loaded her wagon to drive back to Ames was to walk once more to the fence, alone, and stand looking north at the ruined country, and Verna came and stood beside her, because it seemed the thing to do. Far off, the smoke still stood in a thin line where someone was burning what the rust had left. Nearer, the ditch grass ran orange right up to the wire and stopped as if it had struck a wall it could not see. You understand what you have here? Adelaide did not phrase it as a question. It isn't a good crop. A good crop is a season's luck. This is a thing men will drive a long way to get their hands on before the year is out, and some of them will not come with their hats in their hands the way that crowd did today. She turned from the fence and looked at Verna directly. You held this ground against a town that wanted it burned. That was the hard part, or you'd think so, standing where you're standing. It wasn't. The hard part is what you do now that everyone knows what grew on it. She climbed up into the wagon and took the reins and looked down at the woman standing in the dust of her own vindicated field. A thing this valuable draws people the way water draws them in a dry year. What you decide to do with it will matter a great deal more than the fact that it grew. Think hard before the offers come, and they will come. She clicked to the horses and drove off north, up the section road, her students in the wagon behind her with the crates of samples and the covered dishes, and the crowd along the fence began to break up as she went. Wagons pulling out one at a time, men riding home to their own dead fields with a thing to think about that they had not had that morning. Thorne turned his mare without a word to anyone and rode off ahead of the rest. And Verna watched the straight hard line of his back going away down the road and could not tell, at that distance, whether what rode with him was defeat or something more complicated than defeat, some slow reckoning with a world that had stopped answering to him. Reuben stayed after the others had gone and helped her walk the field one more time in the long evening light, marking with little wooden stakes the plants that had thrown the tallest, heaviest, darkest heads, because Adelaide had told her that when the harvest came, she would want to keep the best of the best separate, that the seed off those plants was worth more than the grain off all the rest together. They worked down the rows in the gold light setting the stakes, and Reuben was quiet a long while, and then he said the thing that had plainly been sitting in him since the crowd came. You know what happens now. He drove a stake down beside a plant that stood a full head above its neighbors. 2 weeks ago, you couldn't give this ground away, and half the county thought you'd lost your mind. Today they stood 3 deep at your fence with their hats off. Come the harvest. The same men that laughed will be driving out here to buy what's in these heads, and behind them there'll be men from the mills and the seed houses in the city, men who never laughed because they never heard of you, and they'll come with money you and I can't picture. He straightened and looked at her across the darkening rows. Every one of them is going to want it to be his. Just his. That's how they think. That's how the whole thing that just burned down around us got built in the first place. Verna set a stake beside a plant whose beard had come in nearly black, and she thought of 3 courteous letters signed by one hand, and of a whole belt of country grown all to one seed sold by a handful of houses, gone to ruin all at once in a single August, because there had been nothing different left standing anywhere to hold the line. I know how they think, she said. I've got the letters that show me how they think. She pressed the stake firm into the brown earth that had been gray in the spring. My great-grandmother's people didn't carry this out, sewn in a hem, so that one man in a city could own it and rent it back to the rest of us. I don't know yet what I'm going to do with it, but I know that much. I know it isn't going to be that. The sun went down behind the leaning house, and the light drained off the field, and the two of them finished setting the last of the stakes by feel more than by sight. Small pale markers standing up here and there among the dark rows like the first few lights of a town coming on at dusk, each one marking a plant that had done the impossible thing, each one a small flag planted on ground that a season before had blown gray off the palm of her hand, and that now held its shape when she pressed it, that smelled of rain and the deep woods, that had worms in it, that had come back. Verna stood at the head of the field in the last of the light, with a hired man beside her, and a dead woman's faith proven true behind her, and 100 hard decisions gathering on the road ahead of her like weather. And for the space of a few breaths, she let herself simply stand in it. In the one clean moment between the long fight that was finished and the different fight she could feel coming, and she watched the dark heads she could no longer quite see bend altogether in the night wind and come back, and bend and come back. The offers began before the wheat was even cut, exactly as Adelaide Frost had warned they would. The first came on a Monday in the 3rd week of August, a letter carried out by a boy on a rented horse, from a milling concern in the county seat that had never once had cause to write to a Merrick, offering to buy the entire standing crop where it stood at a price per bushel that made Verna sit down at her kitchen table and read the figure 3 times before she believed the placement of the decimal. She wrote back a single line declining because a crop sold as grain became flour and then became nothing, and what she had was not grain. The second came 2 days later by telegraph relayed through Della's counter from a seed house in the city, and it was larger, and she declined that one too, though her hand was less steady doing it, because the man had named a sum that was more money than her grandfather had earned mending in his whole life. She understood by then that the value of what stood in her 2 acres had nothing to do with bushels anymore. Every offer that came was a man trying to buy the one thing that had not burned, and the more of them that came, the clearer it grew that she was no longer a widow with a strange field, but a woman standing on the only well in a country gone to drought, and that the ones who came thirsty would not all of them come kind. Harvest could not wait on her deciding what to do about any of it. The heads had gone hard, and the beards had begun to shatter at a touch, which meant the grain was ready to fall and be lost. And there was no machine in the county that could have taken that crop, even had she owned one, because the stalks stood at a dozen different heights, and the heads had ripened days apart from one another, and a reaper set to cut the tall ones would have knocked the short ones flat unthreshed into the dirt. So she cut it the way it had been cut before there were machines to do it, the way Adeline had cut it, with a cradle scythe that had hung in the barn under years of dust and swallow droppings, its snath gray and checked with age, its fingers of hickory still sound. She took it down and honed the blade over 3 evenings on a wet stone until it would lift the hair off her forearm, and on the fourth morning she went into the field before the dew had dried and began to cut, low and even, the long blade hissing through the stalks, and the wooden fingers laying them over in a neat swath she could bind. Marta came out on the first morning of it in a pair of men's work gloves still creased from the store paper, having taken a leave from the boarding house without telling her daughter she meant to, and when Verna started to say something about the wages she was giving up, her mother held up one gloved hand and asked instead to be shown how a body bound a sheaf, because a thing worth doing was worth 4 hands instead of 2. They worked in the cool of the early mornings, while the dew still weighted the stalks and kept the grain from shattering, cutting and binding and standing the sheaves in shocks to dry, and they quit when the sun climbed high enough to dry the heads and make them spill, and took it up again in the gold of late afternoon. Reuben came every rest day, and toward the end 2 weekdays besides, driving out before dawn on his own horse, and the work went 3 and 4 times faster, with him swinging a second scythe down the row beside Verna, the two blades hissing in a rhythm that fell into step without either of them arranging it. On the second Monday of the cutting, a wagon, Verna did not know, turned in at her gate, and a man climbed down from it whom she knew too well, because he had sat in the corner of the diner in June and said the words old-time grain in a voice pitched to carry the length of the room. Emmett Dawes stood by his own tailgate a long moment before he came any nearer, turning his hat in his hands, looking anywhere but at the woman he had mocked. His east half had gone orange in 11 days, he said at last, still not quite meeting her eye, and he had nothing to do this month for the first time in 30 years of farming, and there was a thing he had said at the diner in June that he would give a good deal now to not have said. Verna pulled a spare pair of gloves off the trailer and held them out to him. The work doesn't remember what a man said in June, she said. It only remembers whether he showed up in August. He took the gloves and put them on and worked that whole day without a word of complaint, and the next, and most of that week, and when Verna tried at the end of it to pay him, he would not take the money, and on Saturday he came back with his brother-in-law beside him. On the wagon seat, neither of them asked, both of them with their own gloves this time. Word of that spread through Coldwater faster than any of the mockery had, that the Doss men were out cutting the widow's wheat for nothing, and it changed something in the town that no vindication at a fence line had quite managed to change, because a man will forgive being proven wrong long before he will forgive being shamed, and there is no shaming a proud man so complete as the sight of his neighbor laboring gladly at a thing he refused. Threshed in the barn, Reuben had made Weather tight, on a floor swept clean of years of chaff, with a flail Verna built from a diagram inked into the margin of one of Adeline's journals, 2 lengths of seasoned hickory, joined by a hinge of soft leather, a swivel to strike, and a handstaff to swing it, the whole of it built exactly to the drawing, because the drawing had been made clear enough that a person a lifetime removed could follow it. She laid the sheaves out on the floor and beat the grain loose from the straw. Hour after hour, the flail rising and falling, the dark seeds spilling out onto the boards, and when the wind came up in the afternoons, she winnowed it in the open barn door, pouring it slow from one basket to another so the chaff blew off downwind and the heavy clean grain fell straight into the waiting basket below. The best of it, the seeds she had marked with wooden stakes back in the green field, she threshed apart from the rest and stored apart. in stone crocks with waxed cloth tied over the mouths, because that was the seed that would go back into the ground and become everything that came after, and it could not be allowed to mix with grain meant for bread. When the last sheaf was threshed, and the floor swept, and the clean grain weighed on a borrowed platform scale, she had a yield that would have shamed a good field of modern wheat, and that meant nothing at all measured against a good field of modern wheat, because there was no good field of modern wheat left standing in the belt to measure it against. What she had was the only unrusted seed in the county, perhaps in that whole quarter of the state, and the worth of a thing is set by how badly it is needed and how little of it there is. And by that reckoning, the dark grain in her crocks was worth more than any acre in Coldwater had been worth in the spring. The offer that mattered came in September, and it did not come by boy or by telegraph. It came in a hired buggy driven out from the depot by a man named Whitlock, who wore a town suit unsuited to the road and carried a leather case, and who represented, he said, the Crown Milling Company, which owned elevators and mills across 4 states and had watched a great part of its supply turn to straw in a single August. He did not ask to see the field. He had already seen everything he needed to see in a report from a man he had sent quietly to stand in the crowd at her fence in August, and he came directly to the table with the case open and a document laid out on it in a clerk's fair copperplate. Crown Milling Company wished to purchase the whole of the Blackbird line, not the grain. The seed, the increase of it, the exclusive right to grow and sell and license it, everything the college had begun to study, and everything it had not yet gotten around to. The sum written on the last page was $5,000, and Whitlock set his finger beside it and let it sit there in the lamplight so that the number could do its own work in the silence, because $5,000 in that year was a house paid clear and a team and a decade of a laboring man's wages laid on a kitchen table all at once. Marta read the document at the table 3 times, and her hands were not steady the third time through. And when she set the last page down, she pressed both palms flat on it as though it might blow away. Verna, that is the house. That is Granddad's land, bought back in a team to work it, and more besides. That is your whole life, paid clean on a single page, and you would never again in your days sit awake over a column of figures. She looked up, and her face was not greedy, but frightened, frightened of a chance, this large sliding past a daughter too stubborn to close her hand on it. Tell me what you can possibly weigh against that number that would come out heavier. Verna turned the document around so it faced her, and she read it herself, slowly, and she stopped at the paragraph near the bottom where the fair copperplate spelled out the word exclusive, and she set her fingertip on it the way Whitlock had set his beside the sum. This, she said, this weighs heavier. Whitlock's smile did not waver, a practiced man's smile. That clause is standard, Mrs. Merrick. It protects the company's investment. You cannot expect an outfit to spend what we are offering and then watch the seeds sold out the back door by every farmer who gets a handful of it. I understand exactly what it protects. She kept her finger on the word. One company holds the seed, and every man who wants to grow it comes to that company on his knees and pays what the company decides to ask. And if the company decides 1 year to raise the past what a small farm can bear, that farm does without. And if the company decides the line isn't worth its trouble and lets it lapse, then it's gone, truly gone, the way it nearly went already. She lifted her eyes to his. That is not a thing that protects an investment, Mr. Whitlock. That is the exact thing that killed every field between here and the county line this summer. Everyone grew the same few seeds because a few houses were the only ones selling them. And when the sickness learned that one seed, it had learned the whole country at a single stroke. You are asking me to take the one thing that survived that and hand it to one more house to hold the same way. The man's smile thinned. You are turning down $5,000 over a matter of philosophy. I'm turning it down over a matter of arithmetic. My great-grandmother's people carried this seed 1,000 miles, sewn into the hem of a skirt so that no man could own the bread out of their mouths. I'm not going to be the one who finally sells them the needle. She closed the leather case gently and slid it back across the table to him. You've come a long way for nothing, and I'm sorry for your trouble. But the answer is no, and it isn't the kind of no that a larger number changes. Whitlock gathered his case and stood, and at the door he turned back with the flat parting look of a man accustomed to being agreed with. Someone will hold this seed, Mrs. Merrick. A thing this valuable does not stay loose in the world. If it is not us, it will be someone with less patience than we have shown, and you will find you would rather have dealt with Crown. He put on his hat. You have time yet to reconsider. Not a great deal of it. She wrote her refusal formal and final that same night, so there could be no misreading it. And in the morning, Marta drove it herself to the post office in town, because if they were going to turn down $5,000, she said, climbing up onto the wagon seat with the sealed letter in her coat, she was at the least going to be the one who put it into the mail with her own two hands. What Verna built instead took the better part of the autumn. Most of it was law she did not understand and had no money to pay a man to explain, until Adelaide Frost, who had kept up a correspondence through the harvest, wrote to say that a lawyer at the college did this kind of work for the farmers' granges and would draw the papers for nothing if Verna would come up to Ames a single day and tell him plainly what she wanted the thing to do. So she went on the train. The first time in her life she had ridden it, and she sat across a desk from a spectacled man who listened to her for an hour and asked sharp small questions and then drew up the structure of the thing in an afternoon. They called it the Adeline Merrick Seed Association, and it was simple enough that Della Fisk understood the whole of it the first time it was explained across her counter. A member paid for seed at the plain cost of cleaning and handling it, no more. In exchange, the member bound herself to return a tenth part of the seed grown from that planting back into the common store every year, without end, so that the store could never run dry and could never fall into one pair of hands. No one owned the line. No house held it in a vault to be rationed out for profit. It lived instead in the barns and cribs of every member who grew it, 100 small stores scattered across the county and beyond it, which was exactly where it had lived and how it had survived for the long years before a bank and a seed house between them had nearly talked the family out of it. Thing held in one place could be taken or burned or let lapse or sold. A thing held in 100 places at once belonged to no one and could not be lost by any single failure of nerve or fortune. The neighbors came through the autumn, one wagon at a time, and some of them were men who had laughed at the auction and muttered at the elevator door, and would now have to stand in her barnyard and look her in the eye across a scale of dark seed after everything they had said. She sold to every one of them at cost, the same low figure to the man who had been cruelest as to the man who had reset her fence for nothing, and to two who had lost everything and could not raise even the cost of cleaning. She measured out seed into their sacks and told them to settle, after their first harvest, on their word, because a thing given at the exact moment a man believes himself finished buys a loyalty that no amount of shrewd dealing ever purchases, and because she had not forgotten what it was to stand at a bank desk and be handed 19 polite minutes and a closed door. Thorn came last of all, when the first hard frost had silvered the stubble in the low fields and laid a white rime along the top rail of every fence in the county, and the sky over Coldwater had gone the flat gray of coming winter. He drove out in a buggy this time, rather than riding, which was itself a kind of telling, because a man past 70 who has burned 400 acres of his best ground does not spring into the saddle the way he did in the spring. He did not get down. He drew up at the gate and set the brake and sat with both hands resting on the reins in his lap, looking out over the shorn field where the stubble of the dark wheat stood in rough, uneven rows going white with frost, and Verna crossed the yard from the barn and came to stand at the wheel of the buggy, close enough to speak without raising her voice, and waited, because whatever he had driven out to say, she was not going to say it for him. Farmed this county 52 years. He kept his eyes on the field, not on her. I broke the first sod on ground my father was told would never carry a crop. I sat on the Board of Agriculture 19 years. I stood up in the Capitol and testified on the water, and they wrote down what I said as though it were scripture. His hands moved on the reins, restless, an old man's hands spotted and corded. In all that time, there was not a living soul whose word I would have taken over my own about my own ground. Not one. Verna said nothing. The frost was melting off the top rail where the sun had reached it, and the drops fell one by one into the dead grass below. I burned 400 acres in August. His voice did not change, but something behind it did. Best section I own. I stood in the smoke of it and I watched a year's work and 40 years of pride go up black into a clear sky. And the whole time I was standing there, I kept thinking, this is the third time in my life I have had to do a thing like this, and it is worse every time. And not one man alive can tell me why the ground keeps turning on us. He turned his head, finally, and looked at her, and his eyes in the gray light were not the eyes of the man who had thrown dust across her skirt in May. And 2 miles down the road from all my burning, there was a widow with a scythe and a coffee can, and she had the answer the whole time. And I rode out here in the spring to laugh at her for having it. It was not an apology, and Verna did not need it to be one, because she understood that a man like Thorne could no more form the words I was wrong than he could lift his own buggy over the fence, and that what he was doing instead was the hardest thing such a man ever does, which was to carry a heavy thing out into the open and set it down in front of the one person who would know exactly what it had weighed to carry. You want seed, she said. It was not a question either. I want to know your terms. Something that was almost the ghost of his old hardness came back into him, the pride of a man who would rather buy than be given. I don't take charity. I never have. There's no charity in it. $4 the bushel to a member, which is the cost of cleaning it and not a cent of profit over. Membership costs you nothing but your word. She put her hand on the cold iron rim of the buggy wheel, and you return a tenth of what you grow from it back to the common store every year, the same as every other soul who signs. That's the whole of the agreement. The seed doesn't belong to me, Mr. Thorne. It doesn't belong to anybody. That's the entire point of the thing. And it's the one part I won't bend on for any man, and I'd have you know that going in. He was quiet a long moment, looking past her at the frosted stubble. A tenth back every year. Into a common store any man can draw on. He said it slowly, the way a man says a thing in a language he is only beginning to learn. You've built the exact opposite of everything I spent 50 years building. I built the thing that would have saved your 400 acres if it had already existed. She held his eyes. That's not the opposite of what you built. It's the repair of it. Whatever passed across his weathered face then, he mastered it before it could become anything she could name. He gathered the reins. Your grandfather, he said, and stopped and started again. Silas Merrick never spoke 10 words to me in 40 years that weren't about the weather. I took him for an unfriendly man, a cold one. He looked at her. That wasn't it, was it? No. She stepped back from the wheel. He knew whose name was signed at the bottom of the letters in 73. He spent 40 years finding it easier to talk about the weather than to say that name to your face. I'd call that the opposite of cold. I'd call it about the most restraint I ever heard of in a man. Gideon Thorne looked at her for the length of a slow breath, and then he nodded once. A small, deliberate motion like a man acknowledging a debt he had not known he owed until the moment it was named, and he released the brake and clicked to the horse and turned the buggy in the road. He came back the following week with sacks and his word, and he signed the association's book in a hand, grown shaky with age below, the names of men who had worked for him, and men he had foreclosed on, and men who had laughed beside him at an auction in the spring, all of them equal on the page, all of them bound to the same tenth returned. And if it cost him something to write his name in that company, he did not let it show, and no one who watched him do it ever said a word about it afterward, because some prices a man pays are his own to reckon and no one else's to count. By the following spring, there were members in 4 counties, and by the spring after that, the association's book carried names from beyond the state line, farms in 3 states that had heard what stood in cold water when everything around it fell, and had sent for seed and signed the 10th and joined a thing that had no owner and turned no profit and could not be bought. Adelaide Frost wrote that the college wished to study the line properly, over years, with Verna's leave and on Verna's terms, and Verna gave it, on the single condition that whatever they learned be published free for any farmer to read, because knowledge locked in a vault, she wrote back to the botanist, only ignorance with better manners and she had seen enough of what one company holding one thing did to a whole country to want no part of building another. The money came, despite her having refused the largest single sum of it, because a thing needed by many hands brings in a steady stream, even when no one is gouged, and the bakeries in the city that wanted true heritage flour paid well and paid regularly, and the association milled and sold in enough volume by the second full year that the ledger Marta kept, because someone had to, and she had the hand for figures, close the year well into the thousands. Most of it flowed straight back out again to the members who had grown the grain, which was the entire design of the thing, and which Verna had to explain 4 separate times to a newspaper writer from the county seat before the woman wrote it down in a way that was true, that the association was not a business that happened to help farmers, but a body of farmers that happened to move money, and that the difference between those two things was the difference between everything that had burned in August and the one field that had not. The land itself came back to her in March in the plainest possible way, without ceremony or speech. The remaining acres of the original Merrick ground, the balance of the 200 that had been split off in the foreclosure and sold twice over in the years since, came up for sale when the family that held them gave up at last on a hay operation that had never once made money. Verna bought them at the appraised figure, out of her own account, from the bakery contracts, and the mending she still did evenings, and the $2 a bushel premium the city paid over the members' cost, and not 1 cent of it came from the association's books, because that money belonged to 1,000 hands now, and not one of them was going to spend it buying back a Merrick's pride. Harmon, who kept the county's records and had watched the whole of it happen from behind a clerk's desk, drew up the deed himself and would take no fee for it. And when he handed it across to her, he held onto his end a moment longer than he needed to, the way a man does when there is a thing he cannot find the words for. And what he finally said was only that their grandfather would have liked to have seen the 2 parcels written on a single line again, and Verna said she thought he had seen it, in his way, long before either of them was born, when he chose to keep a can behind a wall instead of chewing on a thing he couldn't swallow. She drove out afterward to the corner post where the old survey line ran, the line that had divided the ground the bank kept from the ground the bank took, and she stood in the cold March wind and looked at the 2 parcels lying together for the first time since before her mother was a girl. 200 acres it had been once. She had 100 now. 40 she had bought with everything she owned, and the 60 she had bought back with what the everything had grown into. And it was not the whole of what the family had lost. And it was going to have to be enough for a good while yet. And standing there in the wind, she found that enough was a larger and warmer word than she had ever known it to be. 40 acres that had run gray off her palm a year before were not gray any longer. Where the dark wheat had grown and been cut, the ground lay dark and crumbling and open to the spring, and when she crouched and took up a handful of it and closed her fist, it held. It kept the print of her fingers when she opened her hand, packed and moist and alive, and there were worms in it, and it smelled of rain and rot and the deep timber, and when she scraped down 3 inches with her thumb, she could no longer find the sharp line where the dead gray crust had been, because the roots had gone down through it and pulled it apart and mixed it under, and the ground had begun to knit itself back together over the wound the way living flesh does, from the inside, in its own time, asking no one's permission and following no one's schedule but its own. The coffee tin sat empty now on a shelf in the barn, beside the jars of sorted screws and hinges her grandfather had labeled in pencil a lifetime ago, and everything that had been sealed inside it was in the ground, in 100 barns, across 4 counties and 3 states, growing and being cut and giving back its tenth, and going out again to more ground still. The thing a dead woman had put behind a wall in the faith that someone would one day need it had become too large for any wall to hold, too widely scattered for any bank or company or blight to gather up and end, and that scattering was not the loss of it, but the whole safety of it, because a seed kept in one place is only a museum, and a seed put into 100 hands is a future. She was 27 that spring, and she wore her grandfather's canvas coat against the March wind because it was warm and because it still smelled faintly of oil and iron, no matter how the years passed. And she stood at the corner post a while, longer looking at the two fields joined, the shorn dark one that had been the curse of 3 counties, and the fallow 60 that had been coming home to her family for 13 years without any of them knowing to hope for it. Somewhere down in the county behind her, the association's book was filling with names, and the college was writing up what it had learned for any man to read free. And the bakeries were waiting on the next milling, and 100 farms she would never see were putting the dark seed into the ground on the strength of a thing that had happened on 40 acres everyone had given up on. None of it felt like triumph, standing there in the wind. It felt like a debt being slowly and rightly paid, backward through time to a woman she had never met, and forward through it to farmers not yet born. And she thought that perhaps that was the truest shape a victory ever took, not a thing you seized and held over your head, but a thing you passed along the moment it reached your hands, so that it could go on being useful long after you had gone the way of everyone who ever kept faith with a thing the world had declared worthless. Everyone who had laughed at her had been right about the facts, and that was the part worth sitting with when the wind came cold across the joined fields and the light went long and gold toward evening. The soil test had been real. The classification had been real, signed and filed in the county building where anyone could read it. The 3 families ruined had been real families, and the 2 marriages ended had truly ended. And the man who walked off in the night had truly never farmed again. And Gideon Thorne's 52 years of hard knowing had not contained a single false thing. They had held all the information in their hands. They had been correct about every fact and wrong about the only thing that mattered, which was what a person does with the facts once they have them, and the distance between those two kinds of rightness was the distance between a whole belt of country gone to straw and one dark field standing in the middle of it, unbought and unbowed. Knowledge without the nerve to imagine past it, she had come to understand, is only a well-kept list of reasons to quit. And every soul alive has somewhere in their life a knowing and accurate voice that has looked hard at their situation and told them precisely why the thing cannot be done. And sometimes that voice is right, and sometimes what it is truly describing is nothing more than the way the thing has always been done before. The other part, the part she carried more gently, was the tin behind the wall. Adeline Merrick had not sealed that seed away because she knew what would come of it. She had sealed it away because she suspected that the thing everyone was throwing out with both hands might turn out to be the one thing that mattered. And she had been willing to be thought a fool for keeping it, and she had gone to her grave never knowing whether she had been a fool or a prophet, and had made her peace with never knowing, which was the braver of the two things by far. Near 30 years, the answer had waited in the dark for a hand to open it. A person could spend a whole life being right about a thing and never live to see it proven, and do it anyway. Nothing but the stubborn faith that some things are worth keeping simply because they might be needed by someone whose face you will never see, and that the keeping of them is its own reason and asks no other. The ground had gotten its memory back, and so, more slowly and at greater cost, had the people who worked it. And if there was a thing worth carrying out of a story like this one, it was only the quiet question of what someone in your own blood had already survived, and what they had left behind for you in the doing of it, some habit or trade or hard-won way of doing a thing the slow, difficult right way that you had perhaps been treating all your life as obsolete. And that might yet turn out to be the only thing that holds when everything built to replace it has gone orange in the field and blown away on the wind.